Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. As you can see from the headline, which I think I proofread, The Legacy of the Great War and the Fate of the Weimar Republic. And although I am largely going to focus on the German home front during the war and the early years of the Weimar Republic, I want to start the talk today by jumping forward to 1933, the year that the Weimar Republic met its demise. On May 10th, 1933, a few short months after the appointment of Adolf Hitler to the chancellorship of Germany, university students around the nation gathered to burn books, some 25,000 volumes. Books considered by the new Nazi leadership as un-German and dangerous to the spirit of the German people. In Berlin, the burnings there were led by none other than the newly appointed Minister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels, one of Hitler's closest associates throughout his 12-year murderous reign. As the books piled on and the flames grew higher, Goebbels made the following remarks. "My fellow students, German men and women, the era of exaggerated Jewish intellectualism is now at an end. The triumph of the German Revolution has cleared a path for the German way. And the future German man will not just be a man of books, but also a man of character. And it is to this end that we wish to educate you. To have, at an early age, the courage to peer directly into the piteous eyes of life. To repudiate the fear of death in order to gain again respect for death. And therefore, you do well at this late hour to entrust to the flames the intellectual garbage of the past. It is a strong, great, and symbolic undertaking, an undertaking which shall prove to all the world that the intellectual basis of the November Republic is here overturned, but that from its ruins will arise victorious, the Lord of a new spirit." Now, the November Republic to which Goebbels and his supporters so derisively referred was none other than the Weimar Republic, whose short 14-year existence would be plagued from beginning to end by the shadow cast by the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Indeed, so long a shadow did that war cast that even in the final days of World War II, as Berlin lay in rubble, those veterans of the First World War who refused to surrender continued to claim, and I quote, "The Fuhrer said we will not surrender. We will not repeat November 1918, never." Indeed, it is impossible to consider the fate of the Weimar Republic without examining some of the ways, both indirect and direct, that the outcome and memory of World War I, especially the traumatic birth of the Weimar Republic, undermined Germany's first real attempt at a democratic republic. Now, when one considers the destruction of the Republic in 1933, it is tempting to view the Republic as a lost cause from the start. And in fact, it's often the case that when one talks about the Weimar Republic, it almost seems to be viewed as a waiting room for Nazism. And yet, however much that might be so in hindsight, there was reason to hope. Indeed, even during the war itself, as the German Empire slid increasingly into military dictatorship, as the death toll mounted, and as provisioning for civilians on the home front steadily worsened, positive changes were afoot, not least in the creation of a unified German identity and a growing sense of true participatory citizenship. I stress this. This is a crucial point because throughout Imperial Germany's brief 47-year history, a sense of German identity had remained largely elusive. regional identity continued to dominate, wherein people would identify as Prussians, Bavarians, Hamburgers and Frankfurters, but this sense of regionalism. There was no national flag. Instead, the Prussian imperial flag served in its place. There was no national holiday, like we have the 4th of July or the French have Bastille Day. Only Prussia celebrated the Battle of Sedan that had concluded the Franco-Prussian War and led to German unification. The national anthem, although its lyrics had been around for almost a century, would not become official until 1922. The German Empire itself was highly decentralized and run by the old royal houses. Prussia, comprising approximately 3/5 of this new empire, held sway. And with a 3-tiered voting system geared towards preserving Prussian aristocratic privilege, it was anything but democratic. Yet all of this began to change with the outbreak of the war, a truly unifying national moment, and perhaps best summed up by Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, when he famously declared, "I no longer recognize parties or confessions. I only recognize Germans." Now, the declaration of war witnessed, as it did in most European countries, a tremendous amount of support, what is oftentimes referred to as the spirit of 1914. You see the soldiers marching off, a woman giving them flowers. Everyone thought the war would be over in 4 weeks tops, maybe 6 weeks if things went poorly. Even the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which had always been hostile to the anti-democratic tendencies of the imperial government, voted for war credits. This period also witnessed hitherto unseen levels of national participation from people of all social and religious backgrounds. First and foremost, let's consider the soldiers. Between August 1914 and July of 1918, over 13 million men served in the German army. That means nearly 20% of the total population and 85% of all eligible males were mobilized to fight. Of those mobilized, 1 in 3 were at the front at any given time. This, of course, is going to suggest the impact of uprooting an entire generation of men from a world characterized by peace and social, almost rigid stability to a world of intense destruction and death. And in fact, it is for good reason that this generation is known as the generation of 1914. The profoundly formative impact the war had on these men and their outlook cannot be underestimated. And despite the horrors of the trenches, many of these men would, in the coming decades, look back with a nostalgia that to our minds might seem perplexing. Indeed, some of the Nazis' biggest supporters among young men in the late 1920s and early 1930s were those who had not been old enough to fight in the Great War, and they bitterly regretted it. Unsurprisingly, Hitler's stormtroopers, the SA, the brown shirts, with their all-male camaraderie, the uniforms, the militant spirit recalling the trenches, proved a powerful recruiting tool for those who felt that they had lost out on what Hitler and many others besides him described, to use Hitler's own words, as the greatest of all experiences. On the home front, things were no less volatile, although they are certainly less deadly. Employment will rise dramatically, with the result that workers, for the first time, experienced an unparalleled degree of fluctuation, mobility, and turnover. Also, with so many men at the front, women, a previously rather small percentage of the workforce, streamed into traditionally male-dominated workplaces. And to sort of stress this, in the middle of 1917, the headline of a Western German newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung led with the headlines, "Women, everywhere women," full stop. Above all, almost every family had relatives on the front. They had tales to tell about fighting the war, about procuring food, about aiding refugees and wounded soldiers, about toiling in the munitions factories. And as a result of all of this, the war became what Germans call part of their Volksgut. This literally translates to a people's treasury, as in a treasury of stories. You would give a child a collection of stories. This is a collection of their own memories and stories of the war. And as such, the German people increasingly came to resist and resent the overmanagement on the part of the German government. Now, certainly this government, in addition to regulating work, labor relations, conscription, and rations, also tried to manage public perceptions of the war. However, with almost every German man, woman, and child somehow involved in the war effort, popular experience rather than official versions became the way that knowledge of the war was exchanged between the people. Thus, when the Kaiser called on all Germans to come together in support of their nation, he unwittingly created a new nation of citizens. Slowly then, as the war progressed, as things got worse, as we got to the winter of 1917, which Germans refer to as the turnip winter, and even today, Germans do not like turnips. As things got worse, as the Germans are called upon to sacrifice more and more of themselves while continuously being kept in the dark about the progress of the war, the German people forged a new, proactive, and participatory identity. They ceased to be German subjects of the crown and instead became German citizens. They also increasingly became resentful of the high-handed and uncompromising tactics of the military. Thus, by 1917, it became clear to many Germans that this war, a war which they had seen as being just and right, was anything but. At home, then, rapid social and political changes were occurring, and a German nation was being born. In fact, the words standing over the doorway to the German Parliament building, even to this day, read, "To the German people." But they were only installed in the middle of the war, as people convinced the Kaiser, you need to make a nod to the sacrifices and suffering of your people. But those words in German, dem deutschen Volke, still stand there. By 1917, plans were even underway to abolish the three-tiered voting system in Prussia. In this system, just briefly to describe, the richest 5% received 1/3 of the vote. The next richest 15% received 1/3 of the vote. And the bottom 80% received 1/3 of the vote. So especially in small towns and villages where maybe the only wealthy person is the local baron, their vote would count for 1/3 of the total. So highly unfair. In addition, labor gained new concessions from the government, namely that they would have a say in the hiring and the firing and the working conditions set by their employers. Society then was rapidly democratizing in the sense that people were beginning to recognize their own power and the value of civic participation, both of which are essential for a healthy democratic republic. Such participation, though, can be both a blessing and a curse, as the history of the Weimar Republic demonstrates. It is a blessing when the will of the people is used to secure their rights. It is a curse, however, as the rise of the Nazis prove, when that will is used to abolish those rights. And yet, by the end of October, it became clear to Germany's military leadership that the war was lost. The Kaiser did not realize this. He had increasingly been kept in the dark by his generals, but they came to him saying, Germany needs to sue for peace. Now, despite still controlling, and I'll put this up here, still controlling large portions of Belgium and northern France, the front was beginning to collapse and the rate of desertion among the soldiers increasing. And in fact, between, as you can see, November 1914 and July 1918, the front moved very little. And yet, by November 1918, it is most definitely collapsing. Desertion is increasing. Meanwhile, naval mutiny in the ports of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven in October had begun to spread throughout Germany. In large part, this had to do with the German admirals realizing that the war was lost. And rather than concede defeat, they decided to send their sailors out for one last mission, and if they die in glory. And the soldiers basically said, you've got to be kidding us. We are not doing this. These mutinies spread throughout Germany. Berlin was in chaos. The Bavarian monarchy had been overthrown by radical socialists, and a Bavarian Soviet had been declared. Wilhelm abdicated in disgrace on November 9th and fled to Holland, where he lived until 1941, just long enough to welcome Hitler into the country. I should note here that all of this came as a shock to Wilhelm. And when his generals told him that they needed to sue for peace, this man, who liked to play emperor, decided that he would lead his troops one last time into battle, because it is, after all, the 16th century. To this, his one general told him, and I'm paraphrasing, but His Majesty may ride into battle, if His Majesty so chooses, but his troops will not follow him, for His Majesty no longer commands the loyalty of his troops. The armistice is duly declared, as we know, on November 11th, 1918. And yet, meanwhile, workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up across the country. I should say that although the public perceived these councils to be Bolshevik and ardently revolutionary, They were predominantly controlled by moderate social democrats and were, especially in smaller towns and cities, rather peaceful. Even here, this is Berlin. You can see brothers don't shoot. It's not exactly revolutionary as they go and seize these barracks. I should note at this point in time that looking on from the Soviet Union was Lenin, hoping for a Bolshevik uprising. And it was only shortly into what came to be known as the November Revolution he realized this was not in the making. And not to harp on stereotypes of the orderly, obedient German, but one case should suffice to prove why this is not happening. A group of workers decided to seize a train station. And back then, you would take your penny, you would put it in the turnstile, and you would go through. A real revolutionary jumps the turnstile. Instead, a horde of angry workers came up to the turnstiles, and one by one, they took out their wallets, and they took their pennies, and they put them in, and they crossed peacefully through. Not revolutionary behavior. And yet, there is a violent side to all of this, especially in Berlin, where tensions had reached a boiling point. The Social Democratic Party of Germany and other moderates were being housed at the moment in the Reichstag Parliament building, while outside thousands of people gathered to hear what was going to happen. Across the city, in the old Prussian palace of Charlottenburg, the radically socialist, independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, which would be the forerunner to the Communist Party of Germany, was preparing to declare a Soviet republic. In order to head them off, a leading member of the Social Democratic Party, his name, Philipp Scheidemann, leans out of a window. He and other members of the government are gathered in there. He leans out of the window, and without consulting any of his colleagues, most of whom, I should add, were hoping to keep a constitutional monarchy. He leans out the window and declares to the crowd below that there is a new republic. And I quote him as saying, "The old and rotten, the monarchy has collapsed. The new may live. Long live the German Republic." And when he leaned back into the room, everyone looked at him and said, "What on earth do you think you're doing?" They were furious. So in many respects, it's almost born of accident. Nobody expected this move. And yet, once declared, the Republic and its leaders had the tentative backing of the army, with the conditions that the Republic maintain law and order, that it fight Bolshevism, and that it ensure the organized return of the army and the demobilization of the troops. In agreeing to these terms, the young leaders of the Weimar Republic gained a useful ally, but at the horrible cost of being beholden to a hostile and largely independent group of monarchists and reactionaries who hated democracy. The new government, however, entered into this pact largely to prevent the radical socialists from further destabilizing the nation. And in fact, throughout November, December, and January, conditions steadily worsened across the country, but especially in Berlin, where it did get quite violent. This is what is generally known as the November Revolution. The radical socialists, known as the Spartakists, were led by these two individuals, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and they attempted to take over the government in the city. This compelled the government to call in not only the army, but also members of a violent paramilitary group generally known, although they're not perfectly organized, as the Freikorps, or Free Corps. They were called in to put down the insurrection, and what it says down here is the counter-revolution in Berlin, but it says March 1920. These individuals do not want to disband. Again, they are loosely organized. For the most part, groups of former soldiers. Many of them, after 4 years in the trenches, were to some degree nihilistic, or at the very least reactionary. And they had refused to disband after the armistice, as they could never fully adjust to peacetime, let alone peacetime in a defeated democratic republic. They are enemies of the republic. If they are loyal to anyone, it's the army, but even that is not a guarantee. These men constituted a violent and unstable element that would hamper the republic's stability throughout its short existence. Nor was that hostility, I should add, the preserve of the far right. Indeed, in allying with these far right-wing elements to crush the far left, the Social Democrats and their moderate allies earned themselves the lasting hatred of Germany's communists, who proved determined to destabilize and bring down the Weimar Republic as well, going so far as to occasionally ally themselves with the Nazis in the early 1930s to help destroy this republic, especially when it suited the purposes of Stalin, who dictated their actions from Moscow. And so in some respects, the leaders of this young republic are sandwiched on both sides between people who hate this republic. In light then of such a bitter and violent environment, it would be easy for us to think that this republic had no chance. After all, many Germans, however much they might have been opposed to varying degrees to the old system, were neither emotionally nor intellectually ready for the abdication of the Kaiser, especially in such a revolutionary environment. Many, in fact, had hoped, as I already noted, for a constitutional monarchy, based on that found in Great Britain. This includes Germany's first president, Friedrich Ebert, who was actually a social democrat. He, too, wanted a constitutional monarchy. And yet, ultimately, many of the people who came to work for this new government were men like this, or even a bit further to the right. They were known in German as Vernunftrepublikaner, which translates more or less to Republicans of sense. They are supporting this republic not because it was their lifelong dream to have a republic. They believed that this republic was problematic, but they also knew that it provided, in the short term, a chance for Germany to fend off Bolshevism, to restore order, and to keep the Allied powers at bay until the country could regain its footing. And one of the most remarkable things about these individuals is how they put their country first over their own particular political desires and wishes. As such, when a constituent assembly was held in January 1919, the elections for the assembly overwhelmingly came out in favor for moderates from the center-right to the center-left. Together, those parties which supported the Republic polled about 4/5 of the entire vote. That is a tremendous degree of support for this republic, even if it all collapses in 1933. In February of 1919, a cabinet is formed, and a new constitution was voted on at the end of July 1919. Unfortunately for this new republic, though, new elections were not subsequently held, and the Constituent Assembly continued to rule as if it were the elected parliament, with, again, Friedrich Ebert as president. This is going to effectively hurt the government's legitimacy in the eyes of some of the people, almost as soon as it's born. Even still, though, the constitution of this republic was one of the most democratically minded the modern Western world has ever seen. It granted full suffrage rights to both men and women. It replaced a system of majority representation with proportional representation, thereby allowing any political party that secured 60,000 votes to enter into the parliament. This led to dozens of splinter parties in this government. Provisions for plebiscites and referenda also strengthened the democratic nature of this constitution. The framers included rights to safeguard freedoms, including personal liberties, the rights of churches and minority groups. Its Bill of Rights also guaranteed the rights to assembly and coalition, the right to petition the government, freedom of faith and conscience, free scientific inquiry, and, above all, the independence of the judiciary. However, because the old civil service, including judges, had not been cleansed of reactionary pro-monarchist sympathizers, many of whom loathed the Republic and hated the lost war, the judiciary throughout the history of the Republic will continue to favor reactionary elements over those on the left, even though both extremes attempt to undermine this republic. And to sort of give you an example here, as the historian Peter Gay has noted, between 1918 and 1922, 22 political assassinations were traced to left-wing extremists, of which 17 were harshly punished, 10 with the death penalty. In contrast, during that same period, some 354 assassinations were committed by right-wing extremists, of whom only one was rigorously punished, and even then not with the death penalty. A more specific example here would be Hitler's attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government in his infamous beer hall putsch of 1923. And his response to his arrest in that failed putsch was as follows: "If I stand here today as a revolutionary, it is as a revolutionary against the revolution," the November Revolution. A sympathetic judge sentenced him to a mere 5 years in prison, and he spent less than a year of that locked up. Now, as the Republic is being forged, it still has to contend with the lost war. After such carnage, the victorious powers led by France, Great Britain, and the United States are going to demand justice. However, in the eyes of many observers in Germany, and even to a lesser extent a bit in the United States, that justice bordered on vengeance. The victorious powers therefore met with the German delegation at Versailles throughout late 1918 and almost the first half of 1919. Faced with an ultimatum of accepting the peace treaty by May 7th or being invaded, the German delegation ultimately decided an hour before the ultimatum was set to expire to sign the treaty, which they did at the end of June 1919. This is a massive protest in May, and a mass demonstration against the forced peace, which is what Versailles was oftentimes referred to. And the term Gewaltfrieden, forced peace, Gewalt implies something even more violent than our word force might necessarily imply in English. Typo, it's not the signing, but it is the witnessing of agreeing to the terms. The actual signing comes a month later, but people are sitting in watching these negotiations take place, even though you can't really call them negotiations. The German government, the delegation, has no alternative but to sign. Their hands are effectively tied. There is no way that they could repel a concerted invasion by the French, the British, and the Americans. And yet the results are absolutely devastating for this republic and for the German people's faith in their new government and for how this war came to be remembered. The Allied peace terms, not to get too much into the nitty-gritty, there are a few hundred articles here, but the major ones: Germany will be deprived of approximately 1/8 of her territory, with losses all around. Germany will lose 6 million inhabitants, and in an age of intense industrialization, and Germany was an industrial powerhouse, Germany will lose 1/4 of her coal production, 3/4 of her iron ore deposits, and almost half of her pig iron and steel producing facilities. The left bank of the Rhine River was to be occupied for a period of 5 to 15 years, and thereafter would remain permanently demilitarized. The army, the pride of Prussia, was reduced to 100,000 men, although the army continued to clandestinely try and undermine that. The navy was reduced to 15,000 men, and the size of the ships reduced to no more than 1,600 tons. In addition, large quantities of industrial goods, railway equipment, wood, livestock, submarine cables, and the like are all confiscated. Germany and Austria are forbidden from ever uniting, which had always been the dream of German nationalists on both sides of the border. All of Germany's colonies are seized, and a reparations sum is agreed to. But the Germans do not get the sum of the reparations when they sign the treaty. That comes later. It is in 1920 they find out that they are to pay 1.3 trillion marks. This is a sum that, had they been forced to pay it off in its entirety, would have finally been paid off in 1984. However, bonds are issued in the 1920s to help begin to pay them, and the German government just paid off the last of the interest on those bonds about 3 years ago. These reparations are only going to worsen the inflation that had been growing in the final years of the war. And that's because the German government had printed so much and borrowed so much money to cover their expenses that inflation increased to over 30% by the end of the war, whereas it had been about 1% before that. By 1923, as you can see, inflation turned into hyperinflation. And if you ever wonder why even today Germans generally pursue a deflationary policy and austerity, it goes back to this time period. As a case in point, by 1923, the money is almost worthless. People would wait in line for hours to get into the grocery stores because when they walked in, by the time they walked out a half an hour later, their money was worth even less. People would go to restaurants and order a cup of coffee. It might be 1,000 marks. By the time they drank their coffee, it might cost 3,000 marks. That's how quickly it went. By 1923, it cost approximately 25 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. And to put that in context, that is worth more than all of Berlin's real estate in 1914. Somewhat amusingly, and you can't blame them for trying, the German government offered at this point in time to pay off all of their debt. 1.3 trillion marks will write you a check. And of course, the Allies are not going to accept this. But they did, however, realize that if Germany were to ever have a chance of paying anything back, that the country's currency must be stabilized. And to that end, an American committee, headed by Charles Dawes and Owen Young, came up with a plan, and known as the Dawes Plan. It went briefly as follows. In return for a loan of 800 million gold marks, This would provide the backing for the new currency, of course. Germany would agree to make guaranteed annual payments, the revenue of which would come from bond issues and specially earmarked budget and railway surpluses. The plan worked, and Germany's economy began to improve to the point that by 1928, a year before the Great Depression struck, the standard of living, the average standard of living in Germany, was higher than it had been in 1912. Of course, after the chaos and the humiliation of this lost war, it is oftentimes lost on the average German. And in fact, at the time of this plan, many Germans were furious at it. They actively campaigned against it, claiming that it violated German sovereignty. And in fact, members of the rightist German National People's Party, the party of the military and the aristocracy, actually referred to it as a second Versailles, a term suggesting how much this lost war continued to resonate with the German people 6 years after the fact. And yet perhaps most damaging in this treaty, at least for public morale, was the infamous war guilt clause. This clause, in signing it, this clause demanded that Germany accept full responsibility for having caused the war. And this will come as a devastating blow to the Germans. After all, they had been told by their government over and over that this was a war of defense, one waged on behalf of Austria-Hungary. And so shock and disbelief and anger is going to characterize the German response. And the government of this young republic had to assume full blame from the German people for accepting these terms of the treaty, even though it was largely blameless. And it therefore earned for itself the hatred of millions. In fact, most people, even those who supported the Republic more or less, hated the treaty and were furious that the government signed it. Also incredibly damaging for the new government's credibility was that the military, which had led Germany into the war, which had consistently lied to and manipulated the German people, was able to claim that the politicians of the new republic were responsible for the lost war in its entirety. And in 1919, a hearing was held by the newly created parliament to determine the army's guilt in failing to win this war. In particular, the Germans wanted to know how they could have lost when they still controlled large portions of France and Belgium. And indeed, none of the Allies had managed to conquer. Paul von Hindenburg, the famous general and enemy of the Republic and future president of the Republic starting in 1925, claimed that the army had not been defeated on the field, but it had lost because it had been stabbed in the back. It had been stabbed in the back by a collection of internal foes, by socialists, by pacifists, by internationalists, by Republicans, and above all, by the Jews. In short, all of the groups that the far right in Germany associated with the government of this young republic. This in turn gave birth to the stab in the back legend, and as the picture demonstrates, of all the groups targeted by the Nazis and their supporters, the Jews were seen as shouldering the blame because they were seen as pulling the strings behind all of these groups. As a consequence of this legend, and in ways similar to the Treaty of Versailles, the government was blamed wholly for the lost war. And even in the minds of those who neither loved nor hated the Republic and were sort of lukewarm, doubt was sown about this Republic's true intentions. Doubt which would only grow as the Great Depression once again threw this country into economic chaos and seemed to prove that this government was incapable of governing. And in fact, the words Versailles, or phrases like the November Republic and November criminals, became commonplace catchwords for anything and everything that enemies of this republic hated about the government. And it all stemmed from the lost war. The army escapes all responsibility for this and will continue to hamper and try and undermine this new government until its collapse. And this army, rather than appreciating how lucky it was to have escaped punishment for its behavior, was able to defy the government until finally, in 1933, they put into power a man whom they completely underestimated, whom they thought they could control, Adolf Hitler. The man who promised to rescue Germany from the November Republic, the man who claimed that he and he alone could break the shackles of Versailles, the man who claimed that never again would Germany suffer another 1918. Thank you.